Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and I'm going to be summarising some of the more interesting and revelatory aspects of the CAS review. I'll be explaining what that is, why it's important, what its focus is, almost as importantly what it isn't. I'm already seeing a lot of misrepresentation online about what it claims and what the implications are. So I'm going to go through it. It's a 400 plus page report. Don't worry, I'm not going through it page by page. I've highlighted some findings which I think are worth sharing. So keep in mind this isn't the entire report. I will put a link to the entire report in the show notes. But just to give you a bit of context, this was an independent report commissioned in 2020 into gender services clinics, how they were provided to children, young adults, etc., and what improvements could be made. This was undertaken by Hilary Cass, a former paediatrician, I believe, and we're now at 2024, 4 years later, we have the final report. We did have an interim report, which did provide some interesting insight, but this is the full thing completed in the full light of day. And I have to say, just after a one read through of it, it's incredibly robust, evidence-based, compassionate, even-handed as well. It's not the sort of turf versus TRA decider that some people may think. It's not a kind of partisan report trotted out to help one particular viewpoint or not. It is laser focused entirely on alleviating the distress of gender distressed children, the best ways to do that, what would be a better option for them, what has been tried, hasn't worked, where the evidence lies, things like that. So buckle up, people, we're going in. Okay, so the title of the report is Independent Review of Gender Identity Services for Children and Young People. That's Dr. Hilary Cass, the retired paediatrician, whose responsibility it was to compile this report. And I think the comments she makes at the start of the report will give you an idea of what this report is about, what its goals are, what its aims are, what it's trying to achieve. So as highlighted, this review is not about defining what it means to be trans, nor is it about undermining the validity of trans identities, challenging the right of people to express themselves, or rolling back on people's rights to healthcare. It is about what the healthcare approach should be and how best to help the growing number of children and young people who are looking for support from the NHS in relation to their gender identity. Now that to me is as clear as day in regards to what is trying to be accomplished here, what the concerns are. And the concerns there are young people and the healthcare they're receiving for their gender related issues. Right out the gate, she's kind of letting us know she's not she's not playing part of this culture war, which is raging online, which I played my part in to an extent. It's typically thought of as a war between so-called TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminist. These are people very staunch in their position that a woman is an adult human female. Humans cannot change their sex. Sex is binary and immutable. And this is a fact that should not lead to any encroachment on the rights of women to single-sex spaces, in a nutshell. The TRA side of the debate, trans rights activists, they would say, well, we believe sex is on a spectrum. You can be born in the wrong body, in fact. And this kind of incongruence between how you feel your gender is represented, almost like a gendered soul, versus your physical self, your body. There's an incongruence between those things that can be alleviated perhaps with medical intervention, perhaps surgery, and you can live as the opposite sex from which you was born. There's an idea in their mind that sex is assigned at birth rather than observed. And this is not to make it seem like I'm sat on the fence here saying it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. It's definitely not. So, I mean, if you look at the gender critical or TERF side of things, I lean TERFy quite heavily. I've made no secret of that. I just feel like the science is on their side. The commitment to open discussion is on their side. And I believe they're being vindicated with every passing moment. Every credible report seems to back up their ideas. Now, Can any movement or focus have its excesses and extreme elements? Or people that go too far, perhaps? Yep, sure, I've seen that on the turf side, but to a tiny extent, and I think I've been on the receiving end of some of it, but that pales in absolute comparison to the lunacy I'm seeing coming from the trans rights activist, or the gender ideologues, as I prefer to call them. So we're not going to read the entire report, but the report quite handily summarises a lot of the key findings right up front. So we're going to go through a number of them, and I'm going to give you some commentary on what I think that means, but please do read the full report at your leisure. This is a very important point straight from the foreword of the report, and I quote, "There are few other areas of healthcare where professionals are so afraid to openly discuss their views, where people are vilified on social media, and where name-calling echoes the worst bullying behaviour. This must stop. Polarisation and stifling of debate do nothing to help the young people caught in the middle of a stormy social discourse, and in the long run will also hamper the research that is essential to finding the best way of supporting them to thrive." Now, can anyone tell me which side of this debate leans on the principle of no debate? Anyone who has publicly said words to the tune of humans can't change sex, human sex is binary and immutable, or have said perhaps that gender affirming care, affirming the idea that children may be trapped in the wrong body, may be dangerous and harmful, they get the full force of social media outrage on their back. They may even find themselves kind of traipsed into the HR department for their views. So and we've got here one of the findings of this independent report is saying this is actually harming people caught in the middle of this. So really, we need to have open discussion, open debate. This is one of the first things that attracted me to this debate, was the fact that anyone who had an opinion on it, people who seemed to be making reasonable noises against the idea of sort of trans gender ideology, were instantly crucified in the court of public opinion. So that's always a red flag for me if somebody else is deciding on my behalf what ideas I can and can't hear. And obviously we've got the conclusion from this report that's damaging to this whole debate. We could have told you this beforehand, and we have been telling you, in fact. Another point on language, just to give you an idea of how this report truly is non-partisan, how it's not coming down on either side of the debate here in terms of who's right and wrong. The review tries as far as possible to use language in terms that are respectful and acknowledge diversity, but that also accurately describe the complexity of what we are trying to articulate. So there's a concern here about how we describe people with various issues related to gender, preferred pronouns, things like that. And this report's trying to stay respectful. Other people not so respectful, and that kind of, plays their hand as to which side of the debate they come down on. This report, once again, has nothing but the welfare and well-being of young adults and children firmly in its sights. So this brings me to the summary and recommendations from this entire report, which I have to say the appendix section and the reference section is like something I haven't seen before. There's been an incredible amount of due diligence to appeal to sort of peer-reviewed data on sort of medical issues, drugs, things like that, to get you the most up-to-date, accurate picture of what has been going on and what we should do going forward. People will and do obviously make comparisons to healthcare services visited on gay people in the past. In living memory under the NHS, you could get services to help cure homosexuality, aversion therapy, things like that. So a lot of people are playing this game now where they're trying to say the idea of being too critical of gender affirming care is pretty much the same thing. We're trying to erase the existence of trans people. We're trying to cure away the trans. Something very different is going on here. And the way you navigate this, to my mind, certainly is to appeal to the best possible data and research. And this report really does that to an excessive extent almost. So from the summary and recommendations, the aim of this review is to make recommendations that ensure that children and young people who are questioning their gender identity or experiencing gender dysphoria receive a high standard of care. Care that meets their needs, is safe, holistic and effective. At its heart are vulnerable children and young people, and an NHS service unable to cope with the demand. Now, the issue we've had here previously with sort of gender services is the fact that the affirmation model was default. So somebody who perhaps a young adult, a child who felt that they were trapped in the wrong body or had some sort of gender dysphoria, some distress and discomfort about what they, kind of mismatch between their body and perceived gender, would often get signposted to gender services. So the word that really jumps out at me in this little bit is the word holistic, which is something many of us have been, many people who are deep in the sort of activism on this have been shouting for the longest time. The idea of a varied overall approach to the distress and issues these young people have, because as we'll find out and probably get to, there's a lot of correlation with other issues related to mental health, anxiety, depression, self-harm, autism, things like that. And the fear was, and I think this has since been vindicated, is that people who said they are suffering gender distress or gender dysphoria, things like that, would be signposted towards a gender clinic. Now, a gender clinic does what a gender clinic does and sees the entire issue purely through the prism of gender affirming care. So it would be a case of, if somebody says they're trapped in the wrong body, they would be treated and things would proceed as though that was the case. And like I say, there's a lot of other things wrapped up with this that correlate quite heavily that weren't being taken into consideration, and we'll get to why that has been to the huge detriment of children and young adults momentarily. So number 4, there are conflicting views about the clinical approach, with expectation at time being far from usual clinical practice. This has made some clinicians fearful of working with gender questioning young people, despite their presentation being similar to many children and young people presenting to other NHS services. Although some think the clinical approach should be based on a social justice model, the NHS works in an evidence-based way. So there's this battle here between what feels morally correct from the social justice contingent versus what is based and rooted in evidence. And when it comes to medicalisation and medical treatment and care, we should always heavily lean towards the evidence-based. It seems pretty redundant to point that out, or at least I hoped it would be, but seeing some of the reactions now in response to this report online from a lot of activists and politicians from the Labour camp and the Greens is very, very concerning, how much they have just hand-waved away all the concerns about children's welfare and what is best for children who are suffering from gender dysphoria. So, whilst navigating a way through the surrounding culture war, the review has been acutely and increasingly aware of the need for evidence to support its thinking, and ultimately the final recommendations made in this report. So again, this report's heavily leaning on evidence. When the review started, the evidence base, particularly in relation to the use of puberty blockers and masculinizing, feminizing hormones, had already been shown to be weak. There was and remains a lot of misinformation easily accessible online, with opposing sides of the debate pointing to research to justify position, regardless of the quality of the studies. Now, this is a massive point here, and this doesn't even diminish the arguments that people make about how harmful puberty blockers are, if perhaps they're maybe over-egging the dangers of puberty blockers. The fact that there isn't good evidence either way on the long-term effects should really be a red flag in the first place. Puberty blockers, for those that don't know, the issue we have here is puberty blockers are both described as completely harmless and reversible, which is true, and it is also true that they are completely harmful and the long-term effects are unknown, and I'll explain why. Puberty blockers are used on label for their initial purpose for precocious puberty. So this is for treating youngsters who seem to be going through puberty far too early. This can have implications of health for them when this happens. Now, puberty blockers, what they would do for a temporary time only would be to pause that process, to give time for the young person to develop a bit more so that no complications can arise from precocious puberty. And once they cease that medication, puberty will begin, resume, whatever. And the data suggests, the long-term data we've got on this suggests that this happens with, few to limited side effects. It's low risk if they're used for their initial purpose. That's not how they're being used, however, in the context of gender services. They are being used to completely halt puberty. Now, the long-term data for the effects of that we just don't have, because this is a fairly recent phenomenon in our culture and society. And some of the data that we are getting now is quite concerning in relation to affecting bone density, things like that. And I suppose the most concerning thing about puberty blockers to a certain extent is the fact that they are prescribed originally in the gender context under the guise of buying time, allowing the person time to think, to decide whether or not they want to carry down the path of, gender transition, medicalization, etc. What we found, however, and this is found, emphatically in the data, is that once you start prescribing puberty blockers for gender distress, that almost guarantees you a path to the next stage of hormone replacement and then surgical transition. You're kind of locked in to that pathway. Whereas if people who experience gender distress or gender dysphoria aren't medicalized and are allowed to just go through puberty the natural way, the overwhelming majority of them desist from this distress and this gender dysphoria. So it's kind of throwing up that question into the air as to whether puberty blockers are helping quote-unquote transgender people, children, or whether they're creating transgender people. Okay, next point. To scrutinise the existing evidence, the review commissioned a robust and independent evidence review and research programme from the University of York to inform its recommendations and remain cautious in its advice whilst awaiting the findings. So this is a report that does make some recommendations, some very helpful recommendations, but there's an air of caution about, getting ahead of the game before all the evidence in. They've took a very holistic view of all the available data and tried to come to the best possible recommendations that don't serve political ideology of any stripe, but once again are here to serve the welfare and the best interest of these young children who are experiencing gender distress. So the University of York's programme of work has shown that there continues to be a lack of high quality evidence in this area, and disappointingly, as will become clear in this report, attempts to improve the evidence base have been thwarted by lack of cooperation from the adult gender services. Now that is an incredibly revealing point there, is it not? And this is something that came up time and time again in Hannah Barnes's book on this, Time to Think. Because you'll often think about what's happening in these gender clinics and you'll ask, how could right-thinking adults allow a lot of this to go on without sounding the alarm, without raising questions, without whistleblowing? And it turns out a lot of good people did actually try to do those very things, and it cost them a lot in reputation, their career, ostracization, pressure, stress, things like that. So here we see that the adult gender services that provide gender affirming care that have typically treated people with these issues don't appear to want to cooperate with this independent report in order to supply evidence that could be used to draw useful conclusions that could lead to better healthcare for the very people they're claiming to treat. That's incredibly suspicious, that they wouldn't be an open book in that regard and let you know exactly what they have so that they can be better informed in the future. Red flag. Another finding from the report, while some young people may feel an urgency to transition, young adults looking back at their younger selves would often advise slowing down. So that's interesting. With the perspective of hindsight, a lot of people that have transitioned, and this is a very big issue within transitioning, is detransitioners. They look back and they have regrets. Not just detransitioners, people that may feel like they've been sold a lie. They're still living their trans identity, but feel like they've been missold, was promised something that was unobtainable, hasn't manifested. They've got issues still That's a huge issue around all this, and it's very strange to watch how hostile the conversation is to people who are dissenters, who have been through it, who know better than most what's involved and what's at the other end of the tunnel. The way detransitioners are treated when they speak about this is pretty disgusting. It's often very analogous to me how ex-Muslims are treated by the ideologues in their religion as well. I think we're going to hear a lot more from detransitioners in the coming months, years, decades, unfortunately. Moving on. For some, the best outcome will be transition, whereas others may resolve their distress in other ways. Some may transition and then detransition and or re-experience regret. The NHS needs to care for all those seeking report. That's another great point, because the gender services previously the affirmation model seemed entirely geared towards helping people achieve their goal of transition. No concern for people who maybe changed their mind, needed a different approach or support after detransitioning, because a lot of the concerns and issues trans people will have will be very similar to the ones that detrans people have as well. So it makes sense that the NHS needs to create a remit to cover those people as well. All right, next point. There remains diversity of opinion as to how best to treat these children and young people. The evidence is weak, and clinicians have told us they are unable to determine with any certainty which children and young people will go on to have an enduring trans identity. So again, the issue of long-term data, they can't even tell these people that are making these irreversible decisions about their physical self whether or not this trans identity will be enduring, whether or not it'll be successful, whether or not it'll stick, whether or not this will be them for the rest of their lives. They can't tell them that, which seems, prognosis seems a huge part of any medical intervention, for sure. I know there are different gradations of success and probability of success, but it just seems crazy that we are playing with the future of children on something that has very weak evidence, something many of us have been saying for a while. Whatever your views on gender identity, there is no denying there are increasing numbers of children and young people seeking support from the NHS for gender-related distress. They should receive the same quality of care as other children and young people experiencing distress. I agree, I completely agree, and we'll get on to why there appears to be an increase in numbers of children and young people seeking support for gender-related distress momentarily. But the implication there, of course, is that our services for gender-related issues are not up to scratch, and I think we've seen that in the gender clinic of Tavistock being closed, the findings of this report, the fact that the NHS has discontinued prescribing puberty blockers to quote-unquote trans children as well. So this is an area of our health service which was completely flooded. The numbers of people coming into the clinics was so high that those whose job it was to treat them in the best way possible just couldn't manage it because of the influx as well. That's a huge part of this. But of course, one of the reasons it was such an untenable position is that there was only one model and one way of treating these children, which led them to one single route. And obviously at some point that route was going to bottleneck. This report recommends a more holistic approach, which we'll get onto. A compassionate and kind society remembers that there are real children, young people, families, carers and clinicians behind the headlines. The review believes that each individual child and young person seeking help from the NHS should receive the support they need to thrive. I agree. I think a lot of people who are passionate about this issue are very passionate because of the involvement of children, minors whose lives and futures hang in the balance based on these decisions. There are also a lot of people that get caught up a lot in the fighting on both sides that forget that maybe whilst we're fighting over these things and terms and ideologies, there's real harm and real people behind it. So I think compassion can get lost in this debate a bit. I'm guilty of it on occasion as well, so it's something I'm going to I do try to keep in mind, and I will try to keep in mind going forward. Right, this is very interesting. This is a graph graphs are interesting. So this is the sex ratio in children and adolescents referred to GIDS in the UK. GIDS or JIDS? GIF and GIF again, innit? It's GIF. So, can anyone notice anything interesting here? So, these are the numbers of people by year and by sex referred to the Gender Identity Development Services. I believe GIDS stands for, GIDS or JIDS. And it's quite illuminating. Now, there's a lot of interesting things that will happen over time on this graph that I believe are incredibly revealing. So, as you can see, there's a steady increase of people being referred to the gender services until we get to around 2014, 2015, 2016, when it just absolutely skyrockets. And interestingly as well, what we'll see is that the majority of people being referred come from the adolescents female category compared to the male. That's kind of switched around a little bit from 2009 to 2016, and there are reasons for that which we'll get into shortly. So what we've got to contend with here, or what we've got to answer rather, is what best explains this massive uptick in referrals. Now, people on the trans right activist side will say, well, it's kind of a mixed message. I mean, on one hand, they'll tell us that we live in an incredibly transphobic, bigoted society where, you know, trans existence is literally being erased, and that we live under a kind of fascist regime that wants to erase the existence of trans people. That's one message. Then coming from the same camp, they'll say, well, to explain the uptick in referrals to gender services, we could say that we were a society that's become more understanding and tolerant of these issues. They're less stigmatized, so people are more likely to go and access services just for them. It's one way of looking at it. So we'll talk about the competing view on that, because I don't think it really explains that dramatic uptick in referrals, and certainly the sort of change of focus towards young girls either. GIDS was established in 1989. At that time, the service saw fewer than 10 children a year in 1989. Predominantly pre-pubertal birth-registered males, and the main focus was therapeutic, with only a small proportion referred to hormone treatment by around age 16. So not a huge focus on medicalisation. The approach to treatment changed with the emergence of the Dutch protocol, which involved the use of puberty blockers from early puberty. In 2011, the UK trialled the use of puberty blockers in the early intervention study. Preliminary results from the early intervention study in 2015 to 2016 did not demonstrate benefits. The results of the study were not formally published until 2020, at which time it showed there was a lack of any positive measurable outcomes. So, not only have we got puberty blockers being prescribed to adolescents and younger people where there is no long-term data on the potential harmful effect, we're also finding out there was a lack of any positive measurable outcome. So, you know, with all drugs, you can kind of do a trade-off between side effects and benefit. You know, all therapeutics to some extent come with side effects, but what's the benefit? What is essential? Is it getting you to what you want to be, where you need to be in terms of your health and well-being? Apparently, there was a lack of any positive measurable outcomes. So no demonstrable benefit is the phrase there. Despite this, from 2014, puberty blockers moved from research-only protocol to being available in routine clinical practice, and were given to a broader group of patients who could not have met the inclusion criteria of the original protocol. Now, this isn't some like whack job 1960s we'll lobotomise you to get rid of the demons clinic. This is the full light of modernity. This is a million medical scandals in the past current day. This is the kind of thing that should be flagging up before you're, prescribing puberty blockers like sweets, candy, if you're in the US. And again, there are so many people who have been absolutely crucified in the court of public opinion for saying we don't know the long-term effects of these drugs. We don't know their efficacy. We don't even know if they get these young people to a place where they'll even be happy. Some of the data's in and it's not good news. The adoption of a treatment with uncertain benefits without further scrutiny is a significant departure from established practice. Now, I just want to point something out about this report. This report is very even-handed in its language. It doesn't scold people, it doesn't finger wag, it doesn't chastise. It's very balanced. So the fact that it's used the phrase a significant departure from established practice, that's as spicy as this report gets. That's serious business. So the fact that they're pointing that out, they're essentially saying you fucked up, you done fucked up. That's what they're saying. They're saying you fucking idiots. How could you have done this when we have an established practice? We have standards of care. We have standards of medicalization, what can be prescribed for what reasons and why, and how that's especially important when you throw children into the mix. And they've not met that. And they could have known that before, they could have known it during, and they could have known it for the many years after while they were still engaging in this departure from established practice. Next slide, please. 33. A failure to consider or debate the underlying reasons for the change in the patient population has led to people taking different positions about how to respond to the children and young people at the centre of the debate, without reasoned discussion about what has led to their gender, experience and distress. Back again to freedom of expression, open discussion and debate, and the conclusion here that the complete unwillingness of our institutions, chattering classes, media publications, politicians, etc., to have a debate or discussion about the alternative causes of why the population of people with gender distress has increased so dramatically over the last 10 years or so, has had a huge detrimental impact on this debate, this discussion, and ultimately on the care and well-being of children. Discussion is not a panacea. Debate is not a panacea. I like to find out what's true, and the best way to do that is open discourse with a plethora of opinions, viewpoints, etc. And then you can get to the truth. And every solution, rather, to any issue has to start with open discussion. That's got to be the bare minimum level of entry for any topic, especially one this important, and that's why you need to be very suspicious of anyone that starts any topic of discussion with no debate, which is what the trans rights activists have done for the longest time, and as we are finding out, that has had grave consequences for minors, children, adolescents, etc. Okay, so a common explanation put forward is that the increase in presentation is because of greater acceptance. I touched on that before. Well, it certainly seems to be the case that there is much greater acceptance of trans identities, particularly among younger generations, which may account for some of the increase in its numbers. The exponential change in referrals over a particularly short 5-year time frame, 5 years, is very much faster than would be expected for normal evolution of acceptance of a minority group. This also does not adequately explain the switch from birth-registered males to birth-registered females, which is unlike trans presentations in any prior historical period. Something's going on here, and it's unique to young girls. And the explanation, certainly one of the most plausible explanations, that explains this, what's the term for it, rapid onset gender dysphoria, is this idea of social contagion. And this is an area where it gets to be tricky, because as you will have noticed, the LGBT2A plus Q movement, starting to sound like the Konami code, they will attach transgender rights onto the back of the gay rights movement. They see the emancipation for gay people as a similar struggle to what they're having now, and That doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand why they would have shared interest and goals. And in fact, a lot of lesbian, gay and bisexual groups feel the same and are kind of branching off. They're kind of closing off those letters where they feel their interests end, for sure. But because trans rights is very heavily wed now in the public consciousness to gay rights, a lot of people look at this issue and think it is just a repeat of old conservative religious fuddy-duddies, you know, saying it's ungodly, and kind of turning their nose up about the new thing that's happening. You know, the dinosaurs that just won't move with the times, they won't progress. And I'm sure there is an aspect of that for sure, but I think the people who push back, who are the most knowledgeable about this, are not coming from that perspective. But yeah, you know, as you'll be well aware, there was this horrible prejudiced, homophobic idea that you could somehow catch the gay. You know, there'd be this attitude of yesteryear of, you know, I have no problem with gays, but don't let them near my kids kind of attitude, because there was this false belief that you could somehow catch the gay, as if it was somehow a contagion. And that reality and that fact of history is making this conversation much harder, because in a roundabout way, there is an argument being put forward that transgender identities, or, you know, self-IDing amongst them as non-binary, trans, two-spirits, you know, sapiosexual, whatever it is, these identities do map onto trends when you look at where they cluster. And you tend to find that if you have one girl in a group of 6 or 7 who identifies as non-binary or trapped in the wrong body, etc., a number of girls around them will follow suit. These kind of identities are vastly overrepresented in small clusters of girls, which is saying something there. And a lot of people have made the comparisons to perhaps sort of, you know, goth identities, you know, counterculture identities in school. We all played around with them. I painted my nails black, got an eyebrow piercing for a little while, grew out of it. Now, imagine if the trend you latch onto, the culture you latch onto the most, is one that could end with a visit to a clinic, medicalisation and surgery. It's not so harmless anymore. So I think we'll get onto that a little bit later, this whole nature versus nurture debate. There are some interesting findings in the report on that very issue. This is an important point. This is a heterogeneous group with broad-ranging presentations, often including complex needs that extend beyond gender-related stress, and this needs to be reflected in the services offered to them by the NHS. This is a great point, because there's this perception that trans people are one group, it's one homogenous block. They're all basically people trapped in the wrong body. That's the one catch-all explanation that's been floated and digested uncritically and unthinkingly. That's a religious idea. You can't be trapped in your body. You are your body. It makes no sense. It's just a nice myth and fiction we tell people to help explain a very complex issue. And it's very complex issue for many reasons, which the report will go into. So too often this cohort are considered a homogenous group for whom there is a single driving cause and an optimum treatment approach, but this is an oversimplification of the situation. Being gender questioning or having a trans identity means different things to different people. Among those being referred to children and young people's gender services, some may benefit from medical intervention and some may not. The clinical approach must reflect this. So again, this is pushing back against the default affirmation model that, you know, the individual's perception of their gender identity must be affirmed. That's no longer the case with the recommendations and the way things are moving forward, luckily. More on that in a minute. So, I mean, this is a largely UK-centric report, obviously, but it still ties into international concerns. It still ties into the United States. For instance, a lot of the data that we have on this comes from international studies. A lot of the advice some of our clinics were coming from American institutions and organisations. So that brings me on to the World Professional Association of Transgender Healthcare, WPATH, has been highly influential in directing international practice, although its guidelines were found by the University of York appraisal process to lack development rigour. This is an association, an institute, advising on the best way to treat young people from a medical perspective, and they were found to have a lack of development rigor. That's not something you ever want to hear when you're talking about the medicalization of children, pathways to reversible surgery, things like that. And some of you may have noticed WPATH were at the centre of a very public scandal not so long ago. A lot of their internal communications were leaked, a lot of good journalism done on this, and it was found in a lot of these communications. And seek this out yourself, don't take my word for it because I'm paraphrasing here, but the gist of it was there was almost an admission amongst people in that organisation that there was no reason to believe, rather, or no guarantee that any person would be happy after going through this process, or it would solve all their issues, etc. I'll put a link to it in the notes of this video so you can read it. So that's concerning. So one of the first recommendation of the report: given the complexity of this population, these services must operate in the same standards as to other services seeing children and young people with complex presentations and or additional risk factors. There should be a nominated medical practitioner, paediatrician, child psychiatrist, who takes overall clinical responsibility for patient safety within the service. I don't know how anyone in their right mind could disagree with that. So I just want to mention what I kind of referenced at the start of this video, that there are, it's important to tell you what this report isn't as well. And there are a lot of people already spinning this report online as though it's an attempt to remove trans healthcare, as if we're trying to make it, people, not we, as if the report is trying to make it harder for trans people to access the healthcare they need. The complete opposite is true here. So if we were to accept the recommendations of this report, if all the recommendations of this report were to be implemented, people with gender-related issues would have easier access to the services and healthcare they need. There would be more clinics. There would be more clinics around the country for this issue. Closer clinics to people. The recommendation of this report will make it far easier and provide far better quality of care in a more timely manner for those experiencing gender distress. I think the issue a lot of the ideologues have is that there's going to be a focus on the holistic aspect of it, which is to look at, related things first, see if we can work out some other issues before we go down the path of transition. Which, this is standard medical practice, isn't it? It shouldn't be. If it's these people want transgender kid factories and nothing less, by the sound of it, which is deeply problematic, to steal one of their phrases. So recommendation 2, clinicians should apply the assessment framework developed by the Review's clinical expert group to ensure children, young people referred to NHS gender services receive a holistic assessment of their needs to inform an individualised care plan. So it's not a cookie cutter, gender affirming, straight down one path of transition solution. These people are individuals, individual concerns, individual needs, individual issues, co-problems, etc. So they need to be treated that way. This should include screening for neurodevelopment conditions, including autism spectrum disorder and a mental health assessment. Yes, the framework should be kept under review and evolve to reflect emerging evidence. How can any sane person have an issue with that recommendation? Some service users and advocates view an extensive exploration of other conditions and diagnosis as an attempt to find any other reason for the person's distress other than them being trans. Now, I've no doubt people may view that extensive exploration for other conditions as a way to delegitimise them being trans. But what if they get delegitimised as being trans? Surely that's a worthy goal, is it not? If we can find out and alleviate other factors that are causing this gender incongruence, surely that's the preferable route. So it seems to me already that there is an ideological attachment to many people to being trans. That's what they are, and the solution is transition. There is no in between. These are medical professionals. These are people whose job is to provide care. I've no issue with a bit of compassion and sensitivity, or using language which is more psychologically comforting to people who are going through something very real. But at the end of the day, this has got to be evidence-based, it's got to be detailed. The consequences of getting this wrong are astronomical, so that's got to be a secondary concern about potentially invalidating someone's perception of their identity. We've got to hunker down on the evidence, find out what's true. There are many conditions and issues people may have where they've got a particular sense of who they are and what the solution is and what's the cause of the problem, and they may find out after various therapies, treatments, etc., that that's not the case. So we need to proceed as though it is any medical inquiry, concern, and provide the best possible holistic care to get to the bottom of it before kind of deciding transition is the panacea. Okay, number 58. Although a diagnosis of gender dysphoria has been seen as necessary for initiating medical treatment, it is not reliably predictive of whether that young person will have long-standing gender incongruence in the future, or whether medical intervention will be the best option for them. See, this is interesting. This is touching on to this idea that even if you get diagnosed with gender dysphoria, which is kind of seen as what separates people from the kind of social contagion, the identities, the ideologies, things like that. Gender dysphoria is a very real thing. This distress, I imagine, is not particularly pleasant for these young people, which is especially important we get this right in terms of treatment. But what this piece of information is saying, that even if you get legitimately diagnosed with gender dysphoria, that isn't to say this will continue into the future. There's nothing to suggest it will be long-term or permanent, which brings us back around to the data that suggests that if people are allowed to enter puberty and go through puberty in its natural cycle, they will almost always, not almost always, but overwhelmingly desist from this feeling of gender incongruence, for sure. So what we're seeing here is a condition, a feeling that is temporary and limited, being used as the springboard to justify medicalization, irreversible surgeries. 65. The central aim is to help young people to thrive and achieve their life goals. The immediate goal of the care and treatment plan must be to address distress. If this is part of the young person's presentation and any barriers to participation in everyday life, for example, school, community or social activities. This is a very interesting point. For the majority of young people, a medical pathway may not be the best way to achieve this. For those young people for whom a medical pathway is clinically indicated, it is not enough to provide this without also addressing wider mental health and/or psychosocially challenging problems such as family breakdown, barriers to participation in school life or social activities, bullying and minority stress. Yeah, so I think it's worth stressing that opening point again. For the majority of young people, a medical pathway may not be the best way to achieve this. 69. In addition to treating coexisting conditions, the focus on the use of puberty blockers for managing gender-related distress has overshadowed the possibility that other evidence-based treatments may be more effective. The intent of psychosocial intervention is not to change the person's perception of who they are, but to work with them to explore their concerns and experiences and help alleviate their distress regardless of whether or not the young person subsequently proceeds on a medical pathway. Now this is very interesting. So puberty blockers, again, this idea that they've kind of overshadowed other evidence-based treatments is very true. A lot of clinics, if you read again, I keep going back to Hannah Barnes' excellent book Time to Think, the entire raison d'etre of a number of clinics was to just prescribe puberty blockers. They became known as the place you went if you wanted to get puberty blockers. Without that, their entire business model fell apart. It's like, what are we for? What are we here to provide if we can't get people on board for puberty blockers? And this is where I lose all charity towards my fellow leftists who are all in on this. I mean, my fellow secular leftists or skeptical leftists, for example. I mean, this is a perfect blend of kind of supernatural religious claims about being trapped in the wrong body, gendered souls. It's the antithesis of our scientific understanding, the idea that you can change sex, for instance. That there goes the entire field of evolutionary biology. This is akin to creationists arguing against evolution, certainly to my mind. And then you've got to throw in the big pharma aspect, the fact that these are children, adolescents, a steady flow of young adults who are going to be, taking drugs for the foreseeable future. This is a win-win for big pharma, and I do feel like that aspect is kind of overlooked by my fellow leftists, who are usually the ones that are kind of waving the fist at this type of thing, tend to go missing when it's gender, unfortunately. 73, this is a huge point. So one key difference between children and adolescents is the parental attitudes and beliefs will have an impact on whether the child socially transitions. For adolescents, exploration is a normal process, and rigid binary gender stereotypes can be unhelpful. This is a massive point. This is essentially the finding that whether or not a child or adolescent socially transitions largely depends on parental attitudes, i.e. culture around them, the ideologies around them, the ideas around them, and whether or not those ideas are affirmed. And by socially transition, I mean, one day you had a friend called Lucy. All of a sudden, Lucy's hair's been cut short. She's wearing boys' clothes, and she's asking you to call her Luke in school. This is, children I'm talking about here. Now, whether or not that happens largely depends on the attitudes of your parents. So, for instance, if you've got very ultra-progressive, wishy-washy parents, and you as a young boy perhaps like to play with stereotypically feminine toys, dolls, you want to dress up. I think every boy is dressed up in women's clothes at sometimes for fun when they were kids. This is where I find out I'm strange, isn't it? Well, either way, that to me is boys doing stereotypically feminine things, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with being a feminine boy. You're still a boy. However, if you've got a certain type of parent, they may look at this and go, "Oh, maybe we've got a little girl here. Maybe this is somebody trapped in the wrong body," and maybe we'll start kind of reinforcing that idea to the child, and children will believe anything. How your parents react to your behaviour as a child largely influences what you will accept as true. And this comes from the opposite end as well. I've singled out kind of the far left progressive types who seem almost desperate to have a trans child just so they can show how progressive and accepting they are and inclusive they are. On the opposite side of that, you have some very kind of right-leaning conservative religious people who will see perhaps a young feminine boy who may grow up to be gay. These things kind of highly correlate, certainly in regards to gender distress. For sure, there's a concern that a lot of these gender clinics are essentially just fast-tracking gay people to conversion. But they may see this young boy playing with girls' toys, wanting to do ballet instead of football, perhaps, being, more sensitive than sporty, and have a huge fear that this child is somehow ungodly because they're gay. They're going to grow up to be gay, and obviously this is a sin, this is forbidden, this is a one-way ticket to hellfire. And they may think, well, the simple solution to this is, rather than have a gay child, wouldn't it be more preferable to just have a straight daughter? And that's how they will deal with this problem. And this isn't kind of make-believe or fantasy again. This is in some of the reports and attitudes of parents bringing their children to the Tavistock Clinic in the UK. This is documented as well. And it's, just to draw a rather sinister comparison, people often point to Iran as being some sort of progressive, trans-friendly utopia because the state funds transitioning of its citizens. What a lot of the activists will fail to mention is they only do this in Iran because homosexuality is punishable by death. So The idea of transitioning to the opposite sex is seen as a solution to the gay problem as well. Not particularly progressive when you look at it with any sort of scrutiny. So yeah, I'll read this point again. For adolescents, exploration is a normal process and rigid binary gender stereotypes can be unhelpful. And what they mean by that is they don't mean the idea that reinforcing the scientific concepts of binary sex is unhelpful. What they mean is stereotypes. The key word is stereotypes here. So, chastising a boy for doing something perceived quote unquote girly, chastising a girl for being a tomboy, etc., and making them feel that there is something wrong with them, something inherently broken that needs to be fixed through, medicalization and things like that. Boys will be feminine, and that's fine. Girls will be masculine. That's fine. We need a society that's more accepting of those things rather than more willing to claim some sort of mystical trapped in the wrong body solution. 74. There are different views on the benefits versus the harms of early social transition. Some consider that it may improve mental health for children experiencing gender-related distress, while others consider that it makes it more likely that a child's gender dysphoria, which might have resolved at puberty, has an altered trajectory, potentially culminating in lifelong medical intervention. So again, this comes back to criticism of the idea of affirmation. If you affirm something to a child, it's going to stick. That's who adolescents and children are. They are malleable. This is the reason why religion, hardcore religion, really needs childhood indoctrination to do any damage. So imagine you go through your entire life, you have nothing but open discussion, inquiry, science, you can have your own beliefs, etc., and then you reach the age of, say, 22, and you've never seen this before, someone hands you a Bible and says, actually, all the truth of the world is in here. You'd fuck off, mate, wouldn't you? Right? That's why you need to get this in kids' heads very early for it to stick. You need to recruit to your religions at the earliest possible convenience, because children are putty. You can mould them into what you want, and that's why it's so vital that you protect them from incredibly dangerous ideas, of which religion, for me, is one of them, and certainly the idea of gender-affirming care. 75. In the UK and internationally, it is now the norm for many children and young people to present to gender clinics having undergone full or partial social transition. So that's interesting. So at the point of them arriving at the gender clinic, just, before they've had any dealings with gender clinics, they're already arriving there as having already socially transitioned. Now, children aren't coming to these ideas by themselves. This isn't an innate thing that's happening. They're having this suggested and or affirmed by the people around them. This can be other kids in school, this can be their parents, this can be teachers. Sometimes it can be one and kept as a secret from the other, which we'll get into as well. So that's interesting. Before they're even getting to the clinic, they're not even getting there and saying, I feel like this, what's wrong with me, I need some help. They're getting there having already said they have transitioned socially. They are now being known by a different name, different sex, etc. in their social circle. So that highly points to ideology, unless you want to try and argue the validity of an innate sense of gendered, a gendered soul, some powerful gender-related essence in front of you that transcends all matter and or nurture. I think you'd be on shaky grounds. The systemic review showed no clear evidence that social transition in childhood has any positive or negative mental health outcomes, and relatively weak evidence for any effect in adolescence. So that's a warning to parents. A lot of parents, and I don't always blame them, just mostly, but a lot of them, they will be seeing the prevailing narratives, the consensus in our chattering classes, what the gender clinics are doing, and they will think the best thing to do for their child, once they are perhaps started entertaining the idea they are trapped in the wrong body, is to affirm this, to go along with it. They may think they are doing the best possible thing for their child. There is a lot of good intention wrapped up in this as well, which just makes things far worse in my mind. But the data shows, of course, no evidence that social transition in childhood has any positive or negative mental health outcomes. However, those who had socially transitioned at an early age and or prior to being seen in a clinic were more likely to proceed to a medical pathway. So, no outcomes regarding mental health. However, if you're to transition socially at a younger age, you are far more likely to proceed down the medical pathway. So that would, for me, would be a potentially negative outcome, even though it's not completely wed to mental health. 77. Although it is not possible to know from these studies whether earlier social transition was causative in this outcome, lessons from studies of children with differences in sexual development, DSD, formerly known as intersex, that became outmoded, show that a complex interplay between prenatal androgen levels, external genitalia, sex of rearing, and socio-cultural environment all play a part in eventual gender identity. So it's a blend of many things, and that's why a holistic approach is the best way forward. 78. Therefore, sex of rearing seems to have some influence on eventual gender outcome, and it is possible that social transition in childhood may change the trajectory of gender identity development for children with early gender incongruence. That just essentially means that whether or not these ideas are pushed on you from a young age has a huge effect on what you decide to do regarding your gender. This seems so uncontroversial to say aloud, but this is one of the things that has seemed so taboo to many people. The idea that you could be convinced you're trans is so, it's so taboo and offensive to many people. Yet here we have clinical data suggesting that's a thing that happens. 80. The original rationale for use of puberty blockers was that this would buy time to think by delaying onset of puberty and also improve the ability to pass in later life. Subsequently, it was suggested that they may also improve body image and psychological well-being. However, the systemic review undertaken by the University of York found multiple studies demonstrating that puberty blockers exert their intended effect in suppressing puberty, and also that bone density is compromised during puberty suppression. Now, this is a huge finding because we had so many people across our news media, TV personalities, people at clinics, obviously, selling children the idea and their parents that puberty blockers were side effect free, no long-term effects, could be stopped at any time. Now we have the data demonstrating that bone density is compromised during puberty suppression, which is the consequence of puberty blockers, and we still don't have further long-term data of what happens when they are used for long-term. So I don't know what else is in the post in regards to the use of puberty blockers for gender-related distress, but here we already have a pretty concerning side effect regarding bone density for sure. So next time anyone pipes up and says puberty blockers are harmless and side effect free and completely reversible, it's just not true. It's an important point, 82. In regards to puberty blockers. However, no changes in gender dysphoria or body satisfaction were demonstrated. There was insufficient, inconsistent evidence about the effects of puberty suppression on psychological or psychosocial well-being, cognitive development, and cardiometabolic risk of fertility. So not only are we finding out that there are adverse side effects related to puberty blockers in the form of how it affects bone density, which is a huge problem. We are also now hearing that prescribing puberty blockers for people with gender dysphoria does not seem to alleviate the issues they have with body satisfaction. Insufficient and inconsistent evidence about the effects that would have for them. So it doesn't even appear to be a solution to any problem, really, except if you are definitely going to surgically transition, which kind of backs up this feeling that puberty blockers were the first necessary stage in guaranteeing transition. 83. Moreover, given that the vast majority of young people started on puberty blockers proceed from puberty blockers to masculinizing, feminizing hormones, there is no evidence that puberty blockers buy time to think, and some concern that they may change the trajectory of psychosexual and gender identity development. Not only are we finding out that puberty blockers are responsible for quite adverse side effects in regards to the bone density, we're now discovering they do nothing to alleviate gender distress, so it's pointless prescribing them for that. There's no evidence to suggest they help gender distress, so that's strike two for puberty blockers after the adverse side effects. And the third one was this idea that they would buy you time to think and consider your options and decide whether or not you wanted to continue to transition. Well, that's strike three, because it turns out that prescribing puberty blockers may change your trajectory, You know, it feels very much like puberty blockers are entirely causal to whether or not someone is more likely or not to transition, whether you're prescribed them or not, which is very concerning given how much they are promoted in this sphere by activists and how much they were just doled out by clinics previously. 87. The percentage of people treated with hormones who subsequently detransition remains unknown due to the lack of long-term follow-up studies, although there is a suggestion that numbers are increasing. So yeah, again, detransitioners just get the short stick of all this. They're kind of chewed up by the system and spat out and forgotten, and nobody wants to speak to them or log them or keep records because they're a kind of inconvenience to the narrative of what gender clinics and gender services provide, and certainly what gender ideology promises. You know, they're a kind of they're people who have seen behind the curtain, live to tell the tale, and people don't like that, unfortunately. So I'm hoping there will be some more work done in the future to kind of catalogue, get a decent idea of the people that have detransitioned and what they're going through, because we definitely need to hear from these voices. 91. A strand of research commissioned by the review was a quantitative data linkage study. The aim of this study was to fill some of the gaps in follow-up data for the approximately 9,000 young people who had been through GIDS. This would help to develop a stronger evidence base about the types of support and interventions received and longer-term outcomes. This required cooperation of GIDS and the NHS Adult Gender Services. In January 2024, the review received a letter from NHS England stating that, despite efforts to encourage the participation of the NHS gender clinics, the necessary cooperation had not been forthcoming. That is mind-blowing to me, that clinics for gender on our National Health Service would refuse to cooperate with an independent review of their services. Why would you not want to cooperate with an independent review about your services if your goal and remit is to provide care and assistance to young people in a way that is beneficial, evidence-based, valid and worthwhile? I mean, it just makes you ask the question, what have they got to hide? What don't they want you to see? What sort of failings, poor research, sloppy adherence to evidence are they guilty of? I mean, a lot of this is documented once again. Hannah Barnes' book, Time to Think. The failings of these clinics are pretty extraordinary. But the fact that even now they don't want to do something that could improve things, because once again, this entire review is about improving the services, making them more efficient, easy to access, and when these young people do access them, they're getting an all-over holistic service that deals with all aspects of their issues. And the necessary cooperation has not been forthcoming. Again, the language in this report is so even-handed and mild. The fact they've said the necessary cooperation had not been forthcoming, you can essentially read that as they're a bunch of twats. That's what they're trying to say there. I mean, shame on them for that. This to me is one of the biggest revelations of this report, that the clinics, the people trusted to look after children, have no interest in cooperating with a review that could improve their services. It just makes you wonder how infested these places are with ideology, that they will not consider helping improve their services in line with the best possible evidence and methods. 98. Assessing whether a hormone pathway is indicated is challenging. A formal diagnosis of gender dysphoria is frequently cited as a prerequisite for accessing hormone treatment. Keep in mind, this isn't puberty blockers, this is something else. This is hormone treatment, usually follows puberty blockers. However, it is not reliably predictive of whether that young person will have long-standing gender incongruence in the future, or whether medical intervention will be the best option for them. Yeah, so same as puberty blockers, essentially, in the sense that prescribing these drugs often rests on a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And as we're learning, the diagnosis alone of gender dysphoria is not enough to conclude that this will persist further into adulthood at all. So having gender dysphoria, a diagnosis of it, is pretty much being seen here as, okay, we've got the green light to go all in now in terms of puberty blockers, hormone replacement, and that puts you on a further pathway to transition. Whereas there's nothing about gender dysphoria in and of itself that suggests it needs urgent medical intervention. In fact, the opposite is true. It is seen in the data and the studies that if you just allow time to pass, this will dissipate almost always, usually. For one of the main areas of contention in the provision of gender services for children and young people is the use of hormone treatments for gender dysphoria. In developing its vision for the new service, the review has considered the issue of consent. This is massive. The challenges of which were starkly brought to light by the Bell versus Tavistock case. Kira Bell, as you will remember, is a detransitioner, biologically female, went on hormone replacement therapy and things like that through the clinics to transition to male when she was a young adult. She may have been 16 or below, but she took the Tavistock gender clinic to court under the argument that she couldn't possibly consent at that age to that sort of medical intervention in terms of hormone replacement therapy, even though they took her agreement as consent. She won her case, so that's thrown up some incredibly difficult questions for the prescription of these drugs to children in and of itself, even when you kind of remove all the kind of ethical aspects, the potential side effects, the efficacy, whether or not they actually alleviate any of the issues. The issue of consent is a massive one. How can a child that young possibly consent to these potentially lifelong medical interventions for something that would almost certainly alleviate itself if left alone? 101. Although young people often express a sense of urgency in their wish to access medical treatments based on personal experiences, some young adults have suggested that taking time to explore options is preferable. The option to provide masculinizing, feminizing hormones from the age of 16 is available, but the review would recommend an extremely cautious clinical approach and a strong clinical rationale for providing hormones before the age of 18. This would keep options open during this important development window, allowing time for management of any co-occurring conditions, building of resilience and fertility preservation if required. There's a lot of heavy lifting going on in that whole point there. So from the age of 16, it seems like you can get hormones, but this review is putting forward the idea that they should really only apply to people or be prescribed to people age 18 above unless there is a very strong clinical reason for doing it before the age of 18. This provides just this bigger window of development where you may desist from your gender dysphoria. You've got chance to preserve any options related to fertility, because as we know, hormone replacement therapy can cause infertility as well. So it just seems like for most people, there's a huge leap of development that occurs between the ages of 16 and 18. And waiting until 18 before you do anything medically might be of a huge benefit for the patient, which again is entirely what this review is about. All children should be offered fertility counselling and preservation prior to going on to a medical pathway. Now, this is another amazing point, because there are a number of people who didn't realise that infertility would be a consequence of a lot of this treatment, and now kind of buyer's remorse, unfortunately, and have found out they can't have kids, conceive, things like that. It's just a tragic thing. So this idea of counselling, so people fully understand the risks and what they're signing up to, is essential. So this is another great point at 108. The aim is that no matter where in the country the young person is seen, they will receive the same high standards of evidence-based care. This is a wonderful thing, because this, certain gender clinics around the country were known for being able to provide certain things, and you went to one gender clinic for, like I mentioned before, puberty blockers, etc. Now we're trying to push this idea of standardized care for everyone who has issues, so they get the same level of care, which is evidence-based, no matter where they go in the country. So you can't go to one clinic, be told we're not going to give you puberty blockers, and then go to the clinic that will give you the puberty blockers. So it's standardized evidence-based care. You can't kind of clinic hop until you get the desired outcome that you're looking for. 107. Clinical network and multi-site models provide better continuity of care closer to home, and the ability for children and young people to move more easily between components of the service at their own pace. They also allow the workforce to be shared across the network without destabilising local services, and address some of the recruitment challenges experienced by both GIDS and new providers. So there's a huge manpower issue with a lot of this. Like I say, with only a few gender clinics or ones that specialise in certain things, there's a massive bottleneck, which would mean even if they were doing everything to a high standard and an evidence-based standard, they would still be inefficient in their work because of the backlog. They just couldn't possibly service the kind of numbers they had in the manner that these kind of issues demand. So by centralising things, better communications, better interlinks, better shared services, more locations, more clinics, etc., they hope to alleviate that concern at least. 114. Given the increasing numbers of gender diverse and gender questioning young people, it is important that all clinical staff can support them in a range of settings across the NHS. It is equally important that professionals who are involved in their ongoing care have broad-based skills in adolescent physical and mental health, so that young people are treated holistically and not solely on the basis of their gender presentation. Again, the idea that there is somehow an attack on trans healthcare is just a ludicrous lie. The aims and trajectory of this report is to increase the services and to make them more efficient. And the way they want to do this is make them holistic and evidence-based. They're the only caveats: holistic and evidence-based, and there are still people resisting this and trying to sort of summarise it as some transphobic effort to attack transgender people and their rights. In their recommendations going forward, the workforce should include psychiatrists, paediatricians, psychologists, psychotherapists, clinical nurse specialists, social workers, specialists in autism and other neurodiverse presentations, speech and language therapists, occupational health specialists, and for the subgroup for whom medical treatment may be considered appropriate, endocrinologist and fertility specialist. Social care should also be embedded, and there should be expertise in safeguarding and support for looked after children and children who have experienced trauma. How can that be summarised by anyone as an attempt to remove transgender healthcare? I mean, people are speaking about it like this review is suggesting that anyone who wants to transition should stand before a panel consisting entirely of Helen Joyce, Kelly J. Keane, Julie Bindel, and Ben Shapiro. This report is one of the least ideologically motivated things I've ever read in my life. It's so even-handed, its focus is laser sharp, and that focus remains the well-being of children, both mentally and physically, which is what you'd want. That's why you need all these disciplines, this holistic method of paediatricians, psychologists, psychotherapists, clinical. And it's funny because the kind of trans right activists are saying, no, it's one solution and one solution only to this, and that's gender affirming care. Thank you very much. A child must be put on the path of transition from day one, and that's the only positive outcome. I hope people are starting to see how very sinister and dangerous and scandalous this whole thing has been. So continuing with the service improvement, 127, central to any service improvement is the systematic and consistent collection of data on the outcomes of treatment. This is something which is practically non-existent beforehand. Record keeping, any way you could see outcomes of certain methods and treatments to actually even begin to produce any sort of long-term data on the treatment and efficacy of medical interventions. This is one of the huge failings of the Tavistock Clinic, unfortunately. So 128, throughout the course of the review, it has been evident that there has been a failure to reliably collect even the most basic data and information in a consistent and comprehensive manner. Data have often not been shared or have been unavailable. Seems like there is precisely zero due diligence being undertaken on the long-term effects of this treatment, which blows my mind. This is supposed to be medical. This is supposed to be healthcare, and there appears to be no desire or interest to collect data. 139. When this review commenced, access to the specialist GID service was unusual in that the service accepted referrals directly from primary care, a GP, general practitioner as I'd expect, and from non-healthcare professionals, including teachers and youth workers. Now, this is very interesting because we've seen a number of reports now where, children are going to school in the classroom and they're having their trans identity affirmed by a teacher, often encouraged and kept secret from the parents. Parents find out later that their son or daughter have been living an alternate life when they're at school, and this has been encouraged, accepted, affirmed by their teacher without any sort of communication with their parents. And that this is not just necessarily teachers going rogue. In some cases, this has been the policy of the school, which is a massive ethical breach in my view. But there's also this idea that youth workers and teachers can refer people to specialist gender services. I mean, what qualifications or authority do youth workers and teachers have to refer people to medical services? That seems massive to me, especially when you're talking about people who are not adults, for sure. This needs to be a conversation with parents, surely. 144, this is another biggie, which has been touched on. The current evidence base suggests that children who present with gender incongruence at a young age are most likely to desist before puberty, although for a small number the incongruence will persist. So again, that's pretty emphatic in its finding that most people of a young age will desist from gender dysphoria. Parents and families need support and advice how best to support their children in a balanced and non-judgmental way. That is important with kids. I mean, it takes one hell of a parent to sort of pull that off, I would imagine. But there's also an aspect of, pushing back too hard, I think, from a sort of parental perspective that could almost encourage undesired outcomes. So I don't know about finding that balance, striking that balance. Helping parents and families to ensure that options remain open and flexible for the child, whilst ensuring that the child is able to function well in school and socially, is an important aspect of care provision, and there should be no lower age limit for accessing such help and support. Now, that's great that they would consider this aspect to provide support for, because a lot of parents are just doing what they think is right. And when they look out at the world and see what everyone else is doing, what do they find? They find trans is joy. That they hear things like, you can have, would you rather have a new daughter or a dead son? This horrible, horrible idea that if you don't allow people to transition and you don't do it soon, you've got a suicide in the post. That's just a horrible, horrible thing. This, horrible appeal to emotion. This kind of emotional blackmail into transing children is unacceptable to me. But parents are dealing with this. You've got a son or a daughter who's all of a sudden questioning their gender and attempting to socially transition, and they've got to come up with a solution that is best for their child, and they need access to information and support in order to do that. So that's really good that that's included, because I think that's a huge aspect of it that we don't often consider. I think a lot of people will look at parents with trans children and instantly make judgments, and for some it's just it's a minefield to navigate, especially when you're blindsided by this change in your child rather than you actively encouraging it beforehand. 149. The review requested data on the demographics of referrals into NHS adult gender clinics, which demonstrated that the majority of referrals were birth-registered females under the age of 25. So this is massively interesting. I mean, I think there's a huge disproportionate focus on trans women in this discussion. This debate about single-sex spaces, which is a very important one. But while we're having that, I think a lot of people are not noticing the huge issue we have here with young girls, for whatever reason, feel they are trapped in the wrong body, feel they want to transition. There are a lot of explanations for this, but it's something that hasn't really reached the level of discussion that trans women in sports have, for instance. And I'm not to say those things aren't important, they are. I bang the drum about them as well, but it seems like a lot of this with young girls transitioning and the issues they're facing and how they're being chewed up and spat out by these clinics is kind of going under the radar because we're too busy debating all the other stuff. And I think that's predominantly due to the fact that women transitioning to male presents no danger to single sex spaces for women. If trans men rather, formerly women, decide to enter a female only space, they're biologically female, so the gender critical people would presumably have no issue with that. But if they decide to enter the male single sex spaces, that's a risk they're assuming for themselves rather than posing one for the other men in the room. You tend to find as well, there's a few cases of this, that biological women who transition to male, who are athletes, when given the choice to compete with the men or stick play with the women, they go, I'll stay with the women, thanks. I mean, the reasons as to why they'd make that choice are pretty obvious to anyone with a working brain. But again, it's something that's not discussed because then, you haven't got some sort of Laurel Hubbard 45-year-old mediocre human being, up there with the women, swiping medals, etc. So I think it goes under the radar because there's a lack of visibility of trans girls. Jesus Christ, the terminology here. Transgender men, rather, formerly girls, encroaching on spaces, etc. But it's a massive issue because we should care. We should care about young girls and the effect this ideology is having on them. And my last point heavily ties into this data here. So there's a generational thing going on here, as I'm sure you would have noticed. Generation Z, or Z, depending on where you're from, and some younger millennials, Generation Y, generally have different beliefs about the fluidity and mutability of gender than older generations. Attitudes have changed at speed such that within a 6-month period between early 2020 and late 2020, early 2021, Gen Z adults surveyed in the USA became the first generation in which the majority responded negatively to the statement, there are only two genders, male and female. Now, the science hasn't changed, but the attitudes have. So there's something ideological going on there, there's something cultural going on that needs exploring more, because there are only two genders. Some people do this annoying thing now where they try and differentiate gender from sex. And for me, if you're talking about an objective standard, the objective standard for me is science. And the objective standard for what a gender is relates entirely to your sex. Otherwise, gender just means personality types. And that's infinite, subjective, anything and everything you like. I could be a blue gender because I feel like it. Subjective, meaningless. So how can we objectively know someone's gender? It relates entirely to their sex. What pathways they have towards the production of what gametes. That's how you do it. So I don't buy this idea that your gender's separate. I believe there are certain gender stereotypes one can inhabit and perform. Sure, doesn't change your sex nor your gender. You can say you're female gender if you're male, but you'll always be male. And I don't think there's anything wrong with identifying as you like. Have at it. But we shouldn't pretend that someone's literally changed their sex. So the idea that a younger generation who are usually more, science and information savvy, rejecting scientific principles, long established scientific principles, is concerning. There's something ideologically going on there. There are also generational differences in the numbers of young adults reporting that their experienced gender does not align with their birth registered sex. Based on US consensus data 2021 to 2022, 5.6% of Gen Z adults identified as transgender or non-binary, compared to 2.4% of millennials and 1.5% of Generation X. So yeah, the younger generations, there's an increase in trans identities, including non-binary. We probably don't have enough time to get into non-binary, not that anyone knows what it means. Anyway. So yeah, I mean, you've got to be careful. I always try and put safeguards on this. I'm getting old. Am I just being the fuddy-duddy who doesn't understand how the world is progressing and kind of turning my nose up at new identities and new things? How would I know? Well, you can lean on the data. You can lean on evidence. You can take a objective, observational perspective on these things, and that's what this report is intending to do. So this idea of social contagion and ideas travelling between the younger generations, thanks to the proliferation of these ideas on our social medias, bloody Tumblr, Reddit, some of the chief offenders on this, I think you have to look into the certainly the hypotheses of ideologically motivated beliefs are certainly social contagion. 154. The reviewers heard that people experience regret may be hesitant to engage with the gender services that supported them through their initial transition. Consideration should be given to whether existing service specifications need to be adapted to specifically provide detransition pathways, or whether this should be a separate commission service. This should be in consultation with people who have been through detransition. This is another great point. So the idea that a pathway to detransition should be built into the entire gender service is a great thing, just to float that idea out there at the offset that people do detransition, that this is a thing that happens and it can be done and people do it. And this should certainly consult with people who have detransitioned, and as again, these are people who have been marginalised more than anyone in this whole affair. Okay, NHS number. This is interesting. So currently, when a person requested to change their gender on their NHS record, NHS guidance requires that they are issued with a new NHS number. So this has implications for safeguarding and clinical management of these children and young people, and could affect longer term health management, for example, the screening they are offered. So you have an NHS number. If you change your gender, you are given a new NHS number. And I don't know if this is a kind of some woolly-brained idea that you've become a new person, so now have a new NHS number. But what the implication here is suggesting that if you have a new NHS number, it might not accurately flag up the age and sex-specific screenings that you may be required. And if I'm reading this right, and I could be getting this wrong, it is very late and I am tired, but this could have the implication of, for instance, not knowing whether to send a biological male an invite for a prostate exam or a smear test. And as we know, these are hugely important preventative screenings. So yeah, that's a dangerous one. I mean, I've never got onto this idea of dead naming or trying to completely erase any remembrance of your former identity or sex. It's very important that we keep an accurate log of an individual's sex for a number of reasons. This isn't to shame people, but I mean, it's important in terms of single-sex spaces, medical treatment, all sorts of things. From a research perspective, the issuing of new NHS numbers makes it more difficult to identify the long-term outcomes for a patient population for whom the evidence base is currently weak. So I think that's me. I've waffled for far longer than I intended. But I hope what's become clear from this is a number of things. Firstly, how balanced, objective and committed it is to the well-being of young people. That's its entire focus and remit. It seems like it sincerely wants to improve the services provided to people experiencing gender dysphoria, gender distress, etc. There is nothing in here whatsoever that would suggest an anti-trans bias. It seems quite the opposite, because you could probably find a report issued somewhere that was of the mind that all gender services should be closed down. It's all nonsense. Leave the kids alone. As a matter of fact, it should be illegal to provide gender care. Blah 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 blah. This is nothing of the sort. This is very compassionate. It's also confirmed a lot of things that a lot of people have been ostracised for, had their reputations completely destroyed for. People like Graham Linehan, for instance, James Esses. Lost his work and much of his career because he was of the mind that gender affirming care shouldn't be the default and only method of dealing with these people. This is exactly what the report outlines now, with a heavy data evidence based rationale. Graham Linehan, famous comedy writer, had his entire career tanked. Father Ted the musical he was working on pulled from him because he went hard on the idea that medicalising children and gender affirming care could have some pretty disastrous consequences, and that's all here in the report. It seems like as time and time goes by, a lot of the people who were early out the gates to raise the flag on this issue are being vindicated. However, that doesn't appear to be having any effect on the ideologues, who just seem to be getting more ideologically entrenched in their beliefs. And it's depressing after this report's landed with all the evidence attached to it and all the reasoning and all the peer-reviewed journals in its reference section, that we're seeing the ideologues double down, and the only game in town for them now is to look at anything that goes against their worldview, is to label it bigoted, transphobic. And I think we've just got to get to a point where the stakes are too high to care about being labelled as a bigot. I don't care anymore. I'm going to see what's true. I'm going to try and find out what's true. I'm going to gravitate towards evidence, and I'm going to bang the drum about what those findings are. Might make mistakes along the way, but I'll be honest about it. So that's that. I will stop talking at you now. Please find the link to the full report in the show notes. If you've enjoyed this, if you got anything from it, subscribe if you want. And feel free to share it around a bit. It's been a pleasure.